Good morning, good afternoon, I suppose. We find ourselves once again here in the choir loft at St. Columba, and we're going to look at the readings for the second Sunday of Easter. So Easter Sunday is the first Sunday of the Easter season, so the next Sunday, oddly enough, is the second Sunday of the Easter season. And as always, we have three readings. The first reading is from the Acts of the Apostles, as we experience throughout the Easter season. And then the second reading, more unusually, is from the first letter of St. Peter. Ordinarily, the second reading is from St. Paul. This week, it's from St. Peter. And then the Gospel is taken from the near the end of John's Gospel. Now, the readings themselves, particularly the Gospel, are familiar enough. John's Gospel speaks to us about doubting Thomas. But the themes, well, a couple of the themes that arise from this weekend's readings are the tension between communal life for Christians and the solitary life for Christians. And also the tension between living as though we're here kind of forever, and then the expectation, particularly in the early church, the first generation of the church, the expectation that Jesus would return imminently, today, tomorrow morning, tomorrow afternoon, very soon, so we have to be ready. Now, the first reading, in fact, might not be as familiar to as the story of doubting Thomas in the Gospel, so let me just give you a flavor of it. From the Acts of the Apostles, they devoted themselves to the teaching of the apostles and to the communal life, to the breaking of bread and to the prayers. Awe came upon everyone, and many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their property and possessions and divide them among all according to each one's need. Every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple area and to breaking bread in their homes. They ate their meals with exultation and sincerity of heart, praising God and enjoying favor with all the people. And every day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. Now, there are in the Acts of the Apostles a number of these sort of summary descriptions of the life of the early Jerusalem Christian community. Now, they're assumed by pretty much everyone, I think, they're assumed to be sort of an idealized portrait of this very early moment in Christian life. So everything is always wonderful, everybody does everything right, everybody is just getting along fine. Now, we know as human beings that that's simply not the case. In fact, during these days when we're all quarantined together at home, we might know better than ever that even people that love each other and enjoy being with each other, if you're cooped up all the time, as these people were more or less cooped up, if you're cooped up all the time, tensions flare. But let's look at what else is going on in this reading. One of the things that's going on in this reading is the expectation that Jesus would return imminently. That's why everybody is selling everything they have. That's why there's this strong desire to gather in as many people as possible. That's why there's a strong desire to live together as best as possible, because Jesus is going to return any moment. Now, of course, that didn't happen. But we continue to look at these readings because they point out for us one of the ongoing tensions in Christian life, the tension between communal life and the solitary life. Now, religions differ on this. Some religions explicitly disavow the solitary pursuit of God. I think of Sikhism, for instance. I think of Islam, for instance. So the idea that one lone individual would go out on a mountaintop or into the desert or into the forest and pursue God is simply foreign to those traditions and, in fact, explicitly disallowed. In other religious traditions, it's very much key to the experience of God or the end goal of that religion. Buddhism, Hinduism, both laud the person who leaves normal life aside and goes out into the desert, to the mountaintop, to seek God. Christianity is a little bit more complicated. There's always a tension between these two. In the 1980s, when I was a student in Rome, I went to a Trappist monastery, Trappist like our friends down the street at St. Joseph's, Trappist monastery in southeastern France called Tamier. And he was a Trappist, my friend was a Trappist, and we went there for Holy Week and Easter. And one of the things that struck me, I was a Benedictine at the time, one of the things that struck me was how very different their life was from the monastic life I was familiar with, because it was absolutely, totally communal. They never had any private time, except those moments when you took care of the needs of nature. They worked together. They slept together in dormitories with just a thin curtain between one little cubicle and the next cubicle. They read together. They did everything together. They were never by themselves. And this was intentional. That was what the life called for in their understanding. So here you have an absolutely, totally communal life. Now, at the opposite extreme is, this is something that goes back to the very early centuries of the church. One of the famous stylites, pillar sitters, was a fellow named Simon the Stylite. And this tended to be in Syria, in the eastern end of the church. And what the stylites were famous for was that they spent their entire lives on the top of a pillar. They went up a pillar and never came down. And I don't know, I can't think of a more solitary form of life than that, walking up a pillar and never coming down again. Now, it may surprise us, but this still exists. There is, as far as I know, one stylite left in the world, an Orthodox monk in Georgia, in Asia, an Orthodox monk who lives on a pillar, naturally occurring pillar, 130 feet high. He comes down a couple of times a week. I don't know why, but otherwise he lives as he has done for 20 years on the top of this pillar. So there you have the two extremes. The absolutely communal life led by those Trappists, which seems to reflect pretty well what was going on in the Acts of the Apostles, and this absolutely solitary life. And the absolutely solitary life is frankly something that feels foreign to us, seems unfamiliar to us, and frankly not entirely appealing probably to most of us. Most of us would not like to spend our lives on the top of a pillar in absolute isolation. And our disquiet with this tension between communal life and solitary life is one of the things that the gospel is talking about. So the gospel is the story of doubting Thomas. It's on the evening of the first day of the week, when the doors were locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." So this is Easter Sunday evening. And the authorities are confused and upset because they've heard that the body of Jesus is no longer in the tomb, and where is suspicion going to fall on someone to have stolen the body of Jesus? It's going to fall on his disciples. So his disciples are sort of just lying very, very low. And although they're lying very, very low, all of a sudden, to their great surprise, there's Jesus in their midst. Now here we have again that insistence in all the resurrection stories on the real historicity of the resurrection. They don't think they're having a vision. They don't think they're seeing a ghost. Jesus is there. But this Jesus there, really, truly, historically, is at the same time transformed because he's no longer subject to the normal laws of time and space. He wasn't there, he is there. It's not like he knocked on the door and said, "Anybody home?" and they let him in. He was simply present all of a sudden. And he speaks to them. He proves to them that it's him because he shows them his hands and his feet. He shows them the wounds of the crucifixion. And then he gives them a task. He breathes on them, the Holy Spirit, and gives them the authority to forgive or retain sins. But our interest in this story this particular weekend is on Thomas, because Thomas isn't there. Now here's the contrast between the communal life and the solitary life. Thomas, for whatever reason, had chosen to absent himself from the rest of the church because that's who was gathered in the upper room. Those disciples gathered in the upper room were the only church that there was. And so Thomas, for whatever reason, wasn't there. He was somewhere else. And because he was somewhere else, he did not experience what the community experienced. So Thomas made a mistake by not being with the church. Thomas absented himself from the church. Thomas was going it alone. Thomas apparently didn't think that he needed the support and the presence of other Christians, so he wasn't with the other Christians to be present and supported. And so he missed, if you will, the resurrection. A week passes, he's there. So now he has returned to the community. Now he can experience the resurrection. Now he knows what they all knew a week earlier, that the real historical Jesus is truly present. He believes because he sees, and then we're reminded that we who don't have any of this experience are nonetheless as blessed as they, because although we have not seen, we believe. So that's the first reading and the gospel. The first reading talks to us about the ideal community life lived by the disciples in these very early days. Now we know, because we're human beings too, that it probably wasn't so absolutely entirely ideal as is described, but it is described to us as an ideal for us to strive for. What's central to the life of that first community? Central to that life of that first community was sharing prayer together and the breaking of the bread. Now the breaking of the bread is the Acts of the Apostles language for the Eucharist. So Christians were gathered together, living together, sharing all things together, and what they did together was pray together and share the Eucharist together. This would prepare them, they hoped, for the imminent return of Jesus. What we draw from this is an insistence on the communal life of the church. Now this is a particularly difficult one for us today because we can't do it. We're not able to experience the communal life of the church because of the situation in which we find ourselves. Does that mean that the communal life of the church is not necessary? No. It reminds us that it is necessary. We need the support and presence of other people in order to live the Christian life as well as we might want to. And you just hear this all the time from people. On Palm Sunday, when I was standing out in the church and car after car after car after car was going by for the entire time I was out there, people were saying to me over and over again that we miss being here. We miss being together. So one thing that we draw from this Sunday's readings is the necessity of Christian community for us to celebrate the Eucharist, because we can't celebrate it by ourselves. The presence of the Christian community for the celebration of the Eucharist, which is foundational to our life together, and just the presence and support of other people. That presence and support of other people is indeed highlighted in the gospel because Thomas doesn't get it. Thomas isn't present for the others so they can support him, so that he can support them. He's absent. And because he's absent, he misses something very powerful and very essential that he manages to experience only when he's present again. So in both readings, both the first reading and the gospel, we have this insistence on the communal life of the church. We need other people to live together as Christians. The second reading from the first letter of St. Peter has got a different tone to it entirely. This is just a sort of an ode to the glory of the resurrection. Although you have not seen him, you love him. Even though you do not now see him now, yet you believe in him. You rejoice with an indescribable and glorious joy as you attain the goal of your faith, the salvation of your souls. So he's saying, St. Peter is saying to us that right now we don't experience this, because we don't. We don't experience the presence of the church. We don't experience the presence of the church in the sacraments that we celebrate when we come together, in the presence of the risen Jesus who is in our midst, wherever two or three are gathered in his name. We don't experience that. But what it awakens in us is a yearning, is an appetite, a longing for that day once again to be present to us, for that day once again to be available to us. Once again, all of us desire to be together to experience the risen Jesus in our midst and in the sacraments which we celebrate together as a community in the church.